I knew something was wrong the moment I saw Carol Davenport standing at my gate with her phone out, taking pictures of my storage shed like she was documenting a crime scene. It was a cold February morning in Prescott, Arizona, and I had just gotten home from my night shift at the hospital where I worked as an ER nurse. The last thing I needed was to deal with the president of the Copper Ridge Homeowners Association before I had even gotten 4 hours of sleep. "Can I help you with something, Carol?" I called out as I stepped out of my truck, still wearing my scrubs. My name is Michael Norton, and I had lived in this neighborhood for 3 years without any major issues until Carol had been elected HOA president 6 months ago. Since then, she had made it her personal mission to find violations in every yard on the block. Carol spun around, her blonde highlighted hair swishing dramatically. She was probably in her late 40s, always dressed like she was about to attend a country club luncheon even though it was barely 7 in the morning. "Michael, I am documenting a serious violation of our community standards. You have that shed visible from the street, and it is an absolute eyesore." I looked at my storage shed, which was tucked in the corner of my backyard, barely visible unless you were actively trying to see it through the slats in my fence. "Carol, that shed has been there since before I moved in. The previous owner installed it, and it was approved by the HOA back in 2018. I have the paperwork." "Well, things change," she said, lowering her phone but keeping that pinched expression on her face that I had come to recognize as her permanent state of being. "We are updating our standards, and I noticed you have propane tanks stored in there. That is a fire hazard and completely unacceptable in our community." I felt my jaw tighten. "Those are backup propane tanks for my grill and my backup generator. We live in Arizona, Carol. Power outages happen, especially in summer. I keep them properly stored and secured, exactly according to fire code." "I do not care about fire code. I care about our property values," Carol said, crossing her arms. "I am going to need you to remove those tanks immediately, or I will have to issue a fine. You cannot fine me for something that is not against any actual rules," I said, trying to keep my voice level despite my exhaustion. "The CC and Articus do not mention propane storage, and as long as I am following state and local safety regulations, which I am, there is nothing you can do about it." Carol's face flushed red. "We will see about that. I am calling an emergency board meeting and we will be updating those rules. In the meantime, I am putting you on notice." She stormed off before I could respond, and I just stood there, too tired to even process what had just happened. I went inside, took a shower, and crashed for a few hours. When I woke up around noon, I had 3 emails from Carol, each one more demanding than the last. The final one informed me that the HOA board had voted via email, which seemed dubious at best, to implement a new rule prohibiting the storage of propane tanks in residential yards, effective immediately. I called my neighbor, David, who was also on the HOA board. He answered on the 3rd ring. "David, did you vote on some emergency propane tank rule this morning?" I asked. "What? No, man, I have been at work all day. I have not checked my email since last night," he said. "What is Carol up to now?" "She is claiming the board voted to ban propane tanks, and she wants me to remove mine immediately." David sighed heavily. "She cannot do that without a proper meeting and a quorum. We have 5 board members, and she needs at least 3 votes, including proper notice to all homeowners." "Let me look into this. Do not remove anything yet." I thanked him and hung up, but I had a sinking feeling this was not going to be resolved easily. Carol was the type of person who, once she decided she was right about something, would move heaven and earth to make everyone else's life miserable until she got her way. The next morning, I was getting ready for another night shift when my doorbell rang. I opened it to find Carol standing there with two other people I recognized from the neighborhood, Margaret and Bill. They were both in their 60s and had lived in Copper Ridge since it was first developed. "Michael, we are here to conduct an inspection of your storage shed," Carol announced, holding up a clipboard like it gave her some kind of authority. "An inspection? On what grounds?" I asked, not moving from my doorway. "As HOA president, I have the right to inspect any property that is potentially in violation of our rules," she said. "Actually, no, you do not," I replied. The CC and Articus clearly state that property inspections require 24 hours written notice and must be conducted with the homeowner present and willing. I do not consent to any inspection, and you did not provide proper notice. Margaret looked uncomfortable, shifting her weight from foot to foot. "Carol, maybe we should reschedule this properly." "This is ridiculous," Carol snapped. "We are trying to maintain standards in this community and Michael is being deliberately obstinate." "I am following the rules that we all agreed to when we bought our homes here," I said firmly. "If you want to inspect my property, follow the proper procedures." Bill cleared his throat. "Carol, he is right. We need to do this by the book." Carol's face turned an impressive shade of crimson. "Fine. You will receive proper notice. But I am warning you, Michael, if we find violations, the fines will be substantial." They left, and I immediately sent an email to David and the other board members, documenting everything that had just happened. Within an hour, David called me back. "Okay, so I talked to the other board members. Nobody voted on any propane rule. Carol sent out an email at 5 this morning claiming it was an emergency vote, but Thomas and Susan never even saw it before she claimed it passed. This is completely invalid." "So what do I do?" I asked. "Just sit tight. We are calling a real board meeting for next week, and we are going to address this. Carol is out of control, and frankly, several of us are considering a vote to remove her as president. That should have been the end of it, but Carol was just getting started." Over the next few days, I started noticing her driving by my house multiple times a day. She would slow down, stare at my shed, sometimes take more pictures. It was unsettling, but I tried to ignore it. Then, on Thursday evening, I came home from the gym to find a certified letter taped to my front door. It was from Carol, in her capacity as HOA president, demanding that I surrender my backup propane tanks to her for safe disposal within 48 hours or face a $500 per day fine. I actually laughed out loud. This was insane. I called David immediately. "She cannot do this, right?" I asked after reading him the letter. "Absolutely not. She has zero authority to demand your property, and she definitely cannot impose fines without a proper hearing. Michael, I am going to be honest with you. I think Carol is having some kind of breakdown. This is beyond normal HOA overreach. This is harassment. What should I do? Document everything. Keep copies of all communications. And maybe consider talking to a lawyer, because if she keeps this up, you might need to file a restraining order or something." I did not want to get lawyers involved over propane tanks, but I also was not about to let Carol Davenport bully me into giving up my property. So I did nothing. I ignored her letter, kept my tanks exactly where they were, and went about my life. Saturday morning, I was woken up by banging on my front door. I stumbled out of bed, still half asleep, and opened it to find Carol standing there with her husband, Gerald, who always looked vaguely embarrassed to be married to her. "Michael, your 48 hours are up." "I am here to collect the propane tanks," Carol announced. "Carol, you have no legal right to my property." "I am not giving you anything," I said flatly. "Those tanks are a hazard to this community, and as HOA president, I have the authority to remove hazards. No, you do not. And if you set foot on my property without my permission, that is trespassing. Gerald put his hand on Carol's shoulder. Honey, maybe we should just go. She shook him off. I am not leaving without those tanks. Then I guess you are not leaving because you are not getting them, I said, and I closed the door in her face. She started pounding on the door, yelling about how I was violating community standards and putting everyone at risk. I just walked away and called David again. She is at my house demanding my propane tanks, I told him. Are you kidding me? Okay, I am calling an emergency board meeting for tomorrow. We are voting to suspend her authority until we can sort this out. This has gone way too far. Eventually, Carol left, but not before leaving another note on my door threatening legal action. I was exhausted from working night shifts and dealing with this absurdity, so I decided to take action to protect my property. I went to Home Depot and bought a heavy-duty padlock for my storage shed. It was my property, and I had every right to secure it. That evening, I installed the lock and took photos of my shed, my propane tanks, and all the safety measures I had in place. Everything was stored properly, the tanks were secured, and I had a fire extinguisher mounted right next to the shed entrance. I sent all the photos to David and the other board members, along with a written statement documenting Carol's harassment. Sunday afternoon, the emergency board meeting took place at Margaret's house. I was invited to attend since the issue directly involved me. Carol showed up looking like she was ready for battle, carrying a 3-inch binder full of printed documents. Before we begin, I want to state for the record that Michael Norton is in flagrant violation of our community standards and is refusing to comply with direct orders from the HOA president. Carol started before anyone else could even sit down. David held up his hand. Carol, that is not why we are here. We are here because you have been acting outside your authority as president and multiple board members have received complaints about your conduct. Complaints? From who? Carol demanded. From me, for one, Thomas said. He was a retired accountant who had lived in the neighborhood for 8 years. You claimed we had an emergency vote about propane tanks. I never voted on anything. You forged board approval. I did not forge anything. I sent an email, Carol protested. At 5 in the morning, claiming it was an emergency and then declared it passed before anyone even read it, Susan added. She was a school teacher in her 30s with 2 young kids. That is not how we do things, Carol. This is about safety. Michael has dangerous materials stored in a residential area, Carol insisted. Michael has propane tanks, which are completely legal and properly stored, David said. Thousands of people in Prescott have propane tanks. This is not a legitimate safety issue. This is you deciding you do not like something and abusing your position to harass a homeowner. Carol stood up abruptly. I cannot believe this. I am trying to protect our property values and you are all turning against me. Nobody is turning against you, Margaret said gently. We are just asking you to follow the rules like everyone else has to. Fine. If that is how you all feel, then I am going to take this to the next level, Carol said ominously. She grabbed her binder and stormed out. The board meeting continued without her, and they voted unanimously to invalidate any rules or fines Carol had tried to impose regarding my propane tanks. They also issued a formal warning to Carol about her conduct, noting that any further harassment of homeowners would result in a vote to remove her as president. I went home feeling relieved, thinking this nightmare was finally over. I should have known better. Monday evening, I was making dinner when I saw flashlight beams in my backyard. I looked out the window and saw Carol and Gerald standing at my storage shed, trying to open the padlock I had installed. Without thinking, I ran outside. "What the hell are you doing?" I shouted. Carol jumped but then straightened up, defiant. "I am conducting an HOA inspection. At 8 o'clock at night, without notice, after the board explicitly told you to back off." I was furious now. "Get off my property right now or I am calling the police." "Those tanks are dangerous and I am going to document it," Carol insisted. "The only thing you are going to document is a trespassing charge if you do not leave immediately," I said, pulling out my phone. Gerald finally spoke up. "Carol, let us just go. This is not worth it." She ignored him and actually pulled out a pair of bolt cutters from a bag she had brought. "If you will not open this shed, I will do it myself." I started dialing 911. "I am calling the police right now. You are attempting to destroy my property." That finally got through to her. She dropped the bolt cutters and backed away, but the look she gave me was pure hatred. "This is not over, Michael. Not by a long shot." They left, and I did call the police to file a report. The officer who came out was professional and took my statement, documenting the attempted break-in. He advised me to consider getting security cameras, which I immediately ordered online that night. The cameras arrived 2 days later, and I spent Wednesday afternoon installing them around my property, with clear views of my storage shed, my backyard, and my front door. I felt ridiculous that it had come to this, but Carol had proven she was not going to stop. Thursday morning, I woke up to 12 missed calls and a barrage of text messages from David. I called him back immediately. "Michael, Carol called the police on you," he said without preamble. "What?" "For what?" "She filed a report claiming you are storing hazardous materials illegally and threatening her when she tried to conduct a legitimate inspection." I could not believe this. "She tried to break into my shed with bolt cutters. I have a police report from Monday documenting it." I know. I am just giving you a heads up. A fire inspector is coming to your property this afternoon. Carol claimed there is an imminent danger. Let them come. Everything is stored properly. I have nothing to hide," I said, though I was shaking with anger. The fire inspector arrived at 2 p.m. His name was Inspector Rodriguez, and he was thorough but fair. I showed him my storage shed, explained my setup, and walked him through all the safety measures I had in place. The propane tanks were secured upright, stored away from any ignition sources, properly ventilated, and I had appropriate fire suppression equipment readily available. "Sir, everything here is completely up to code," Inspector Rodriguez said after his examination. "You actually have a better setup than most residential propane storage, I see. Whoever reported this as a hazard was either misinformed or has ulterior motives." "It was my HOA president. She has been harassing me about these tanks for 2 weeks now," I explained. He shook his head. "People call us for HOA disputes all the time. It is a waste of resources. I will file my report stating there are no violations and no hazards. If she calls again making false claims, she could face charges for filing a false report." After he left, I felt vindicated but also increasingly concerned about how far Carol was willing to take this. I decided to consult with an attorney, just to understand my options. I made an appointment with a lawyer named James Palmer who specialized in property law and HOA disputes. I met with him Friday afternoon. After I explained the entire situation, he leaned back in his chair and whistled. "Mr. Norton, you have a clear case of HOA harassment. This woman has exceeded her authority, attempted to steal your property, trespassed, and filed false reports with authorities. You would be well within your rights to pursue a restraining order and potentially sue the HOA for harassment." "I do not want to sue anyone. I just want her to leave me alone," I said. "I understand, but sometimes the threat of legal action is what it takes to make people back down." Let me draft a cease and desist letter. We will send it to Carol personally and to the HOA board. It will make clear that her conduct is illegal and that further harassment will result in legal consequences." I agreed, and he said he would have the letter ready by Monday. I left his office feeling more in control of the situation, but I also could not shake the feeling that Carol was not done yet. That weekend was quiet, which should have been my first warning sign. Carol was never quiet unless she was planning something. Sunday evening, I was reviewing my security camera footage just to make sure everything was working properly when I noticed something odd. Saturday afternoon, while I had been at the grocery store, Carol had been in my backyard again. But this time, she had not tried to break into the shed. She had just stood there, taking more pictures and talking on her phone. Monday morning, I received the cease and desist letter from Attorney Palmer via email, and he confirmed hard copies were being sent to Carol and the HOA board via certified mail. I felt like maybe finally this would put an end to the insanity. I was wrong. Monday evening, I was getting ready for my night shift when my doorbell rang. I opened it to find 2 police officers standing there. "Are you Michael Norton?" one of them asked. "Yes, that is me. What is this about?" "We received a report that you have made threats against a Carol Davenport and that you are storing hazardous materials on your property," the officer said. My heart sank. "Officers, Carol Davenport is my HOA president, and she has been harassing me for weeks. I have not threatened anyone. In fact, I filed a police report last week about her trying to break into my storage shed." The other officer consulted his notes. "The report states you told Mrs. Davenport you would hurt her if she came near your property again. That is completely false. I have security cameras that record audio and video. I can show you every interaction I have had with her," I said. "This is retaliation because my attorney sent her a cease and desist letter today." The officers looked at each other. "Can we see the footage?" one asked. I invited them in and pulled up the security camera system on my laptop. I showed them the footage from Monday night when Carol had tried to cut my lock, including the audio where I clearly said I would call the police, not that I would hurt her. I also showed them the footage from earlier that day when the cease and desist letter would have been delivered, and then Carol making a phone call immediately afterward. "Sir, it is pretty clear this is a false report," the first officer said. "We will note that in our system. If she continues making false reports, she could face charges. In the meantime, you might want to consider filing for a restraining order." After they left, I was shaking with adrenaline and anger. Carol had actually tried to get me arrested with false accusations. This had gone from annoying HOA overreach to actual criminal behavior. I immediately called Attorney Palmer and left him a message about what had just happened. He called me back within an hour. "Michael, we are filing for a restraining order first thing tomorrow morning. This woman is dangerous. Making false police reports is a crime, and we need to document this pattern of behavior before it escalates further." Tuesday morning, instead of sleeping after my shift, I met Attorney Palmer at the courthouse. We filed for a temporary restraining order against Carol Davenport, citing harassment, trespassing, attempted destruction of property, and filing false police reports. The judge reviewed the evidence, including the police reports and security camera footage, and granted a temporary order. A hearing was scheduled for the following week to determine if it would be made permanent. Carol was served with the restraining order Tuesday afternoon. I know this because 20 minutes after she was served, I received an email from her, sent to me and the entire HOA mailing list. The email was unhinged. She claimed I was a dangerous individual who was threatening the safety of the entire neighborhood. She said I was storing explosives in my residential area and that she had tried to resolve it peacefully, but I had threatened her life. She called for an emergency neighborhood meeting and demanded the HOA take action to have me removed from the community. David called me immediately. "Did you see Carol's email?" "Yeah, I just read it. It is completely delusional," I said. "Half the neighborhood is freaking out. People who do not know you are scared because she made it sound like you have a bomb factory in your backyard. We need to set the record straight." "Can you call a neighborhood meeting?" I asked. "I can, but as a board member, not as a resident." "You have every right to defend yourself against these accusations. Let me send out an email to everyone explaining the real situation." David sent out a detailed email an hour later, explaining that Carol had been harassing me, that all her claims about hazardous materials had been investigated by the fire department and found to be baseless, and that she was now the subject of a restraining order due to her illegal conduct. He attached the fire inspector's report and invited anyone with concerns to contact him directly. The response was overwhelming. I received emails and texts from dozens of neighbors expressing support and apologizing for Carol's behavior. Several people shared their own stories of Carol harassing them over minor issues. One neighbor, a woman named Patricia, told me Carol had tried to fine her $300 because her mailbox was painted the wrong shade of beige. Wednesday, I finally got some sleep, but I was woken up by pounding on my door around 3 p.m. I groaned, thinking it was Carol again, but when I checked my security camera feed on my phone, I saw it was actually Gerald, Carol's husband, and he was alone. I opened the door cautiously. "Gerald, your wife has a restraining order. She cannot be here." I know. She is not here, it is just me," he said. He looked exhausted with dark circles under his eyes. "Michael, I need to apologize for my wife's behavior. I have been trying to get her to stop, but she is obsessed with this. I think she needs help, professional help, but she will not listen to me." I softened a little. Gerald had always seemed like a decent guy stuck in a bad situation. "I appreciate you saying that, but she has crossed so many lines. She tried to get me arrested with false accusations." "I know, and I am horrified. I told her she needs to drop all of this, but she is convinced she is protecting the neighborhood. She has been spending hours every day researching propane regulations, calling government agencies, trying to find any possible violation she can pin on you." He ran his hand through his thinning hair. "I am actually talking to a divorce attorney. I cannot do this anymore." "Gerald, I am sorry you are in this position, but your wife's actions are illegal. If she keeps this up, she is going to face criminal charges," I said. "I know. That is why I am here. I am begging you, if there is any way you can get her to understand how serious this is, please try. She will not listen to me, but maybe if she hears it from you or your attorney, it will get through. She has a restraining order against her. I cannot contact her, and she cannot contact me. The next time we will be in the same room is at the court hearing on Monday," I explained. Gerald nodded miserably. "Right, okay, I just had to try." He turned to leave, then paused. "For what it is worth, I checked your shed when Carol first started complaining. Everything looked perfectly safe to me. This was never about safety. I think it was about control." After Gerald left, I actually felt sorry for him. But my sympathy did not extend to Carol. She had made her choices, and now she was going to face the consequences. Thursday and Friday passed without incident. I worked my shifts, came home, and tried to return to some semblance of normalcy. The neighborhood was buzzing with gossip about the situation, but most people were supportive of me. Saturday morning, I was doing yard work when my phone rang. It was David. "Michael, you need to check the neighborhood Facebook page right now," he said urgently. I pulled out my phone and opened the private Copper Ridge neighborhood group. Carol had posted a long, rambling manifesto about how I was part of a conspiracy to undermine the HOA and destroy property values. She claimed I was secretly planning to open an industrial propane distribution center in my backyard, and that I had bribed the fire inspector. She called on residents to protest at my house and demand my removal from the community. This is beyond harassment now. This is defamation, I said, screenshotting the post. I have already reported it to Facebook and asked the other moderators to remove it and ban her from the group, David said. But Michael, she mentioned your address specifically. I am worried some people might actually show up. He was right to be worried. By Sunday afternoon, a small group of about 6 people had gathered on the sidewalk in front of my house, holding signs with slogans like "Safety First" and "Remove the Hazard." They were not technically on my property, so I could not do anything about it, but it was intimidating and infuriating. I called the non-emergency police line to report it, and an officer came out to make sure the protest remained peaceful and legal. He advised the protesters that they needed to stay on public property and could not block traffic or harass me. Most of them looked uncomfortable and left within an hour, but 2 people remained, including Carol herself, who was technically violating her restraining order by being in front of my house. I documented her presence on my security cameras and called my attorney. He advised me to call the police and report the restraining order violation. When the officer arrived and informed Carol she was in violation, she actually argued with him, claiming she had a right to peaceful protest. "Madam, you have a restraining order that requires you to stay at least 100 yards away from Mr. Norton and his property. You are currently standing about 50 feet from his house. That is a violation," the officer explained patiently. "This is a public sidewalk." "I have every right to be here," Carol insisted. "Not when there is a restraining order. You need to leave now or I will have to arrest you for violating a court order," the officer said, his tone becoming firmer. Carol finally left, but not before shouting, "This is not over, Michael. The truth will come out." The other protester, someone I did not even recognize from the neighborhood, quickly left after Carol did. I thanked the officer, who said he would file a report about the restraining order violation. Monday morning arrived, and I was actually relieved to be going to court. I needed this resolved once and for all. The hearing was scheduled for 10 a.m. I met Attorney Palmer at the courthouse, and we reviewed the evidence we would be presenting, including the security footage, police reports, and documentation of Carol's escalating harassment. Carol arrived with her own attorney, a tired-looking man who clearly wished he was anywhere else. We were called into the courtroom, and the judge reviewed the temporary restraining order and the evidence supporting it. Carol's attorney tried to argue that his client was simply attempting to fulfill her duties as HOA president, and that I was overreacting to legitimate concerns about safety. Attorney Palmer countered by presenting the fire inspector's report, the police report about Carol attempting to break into my shed, the documentation of her filing false police reports, and the video evidence of her violating the temporary restraining order just the day before. The judge looked increasingly displeased as she reviewed the evidence. Finally, she addressed Carol directly. "Mrs. Davenport, I have reviewed all the evidence presented, and I am deeply concerned about your pattern of behavior. You have repeatedly harassed Mr. Norton, trespassed on his property, attempted to destroy his property, filed false reports with law enforcement, and violated a temporary restraining order. This goes far beyond any reasonable interpretation of HOA duties. Your Honor, "I was just trying to protect my community," Carol protested. "No, Mrs. Davenport, you were harassing a resident because you did not like his legal use of his own property. The fire department found no violations. The police found no violations. You manufactured a crisis where none existed, and then you escalated your illegal conduct when Mr. Norton rightfully defended his property rights." The judge's tone was stern. "I am granting a permanent restraining order. You are to stay at least 100 yards away from Mr. Norton, his property, and his workplace. You are not to contact him directly or indirectly through third parties, social media, or any other means. Furthermore, I am referring this case to the district attorney's office for possible criminal charges related to filing false police reports and violating a restraining order." Carol's face went pale. "Criminal charges?" "Yes, Mrs. Davenport. Your actions constitute criminal conduct, not civil disputes. You wasted law enforcement resources with false reports, and you violated a court order. Those are crimes." The judge signed the permanent restraining order and handed it to the bailiff. "This hearing is concluded." We left the courtroom, and I felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. Attorney Palmer congratulated me and said he would follow up on the criminal referral to make sure the district attorney's office took it seriously. Over the next few weeks, life slowly returned to normal. The HOA board held a special election and voted to remove Carol as president, replacing her with David. Gerald filed for divorce, and according to neighborhood gossip, he moved out of their house and into an apartment across town. Then, about a month after the restraining order hearing, I received a call from a prosecutor at the district attorney's office. Her name was Assistant District Attorney Williams, and she informed me that they were moving forward with criminal charges against Carol Davenport for filing false police reports and violating a court order. "We take false reports very seriously, Mr. Norton. They waste law enforcement resources and can ruin innocent people's lives. Combined with her violation of a restraining order, we believe we have a strong case," Ada Williams explained. "What kind of charges is she facing?" I asked. "Filing a false police report is a misdemeanor, and violating a restraining order is also a misdemeanor. If convicted, she could face fines and potentially jail time, though for a first offense, it would likely be probation and community service," she said. "We would like you to testify at trial if it goes that far." "Of course. Whatever you need," I agreed. Carol's criminal trial was scheduled for 3 months later in early June. In the meantime, the HOA under David's leadership issued a formal apology to me and reimbursed me for my legal fees. They also updated the CC and Articus to include stronger protections against HOA officer abuse of power. The neighborhood moved on from the drama, though Carol became something of a cautionary tale. People started referring to excessive HOA enforcement as pulling a Carol. When June arrived, I took time off work to testify at Carol's trial. The courtroom was small, and there were not many spectators beyond me, Gerald, who had been subpoenaed as a witness, and a few neighbors who were curious about the outcome. The prosecutor presented the evidence systematically: the police reports, the fire inspector's report, the security camera footage, and my testimony about Carol's escalating harassment. Gerald testified about Carol's obsessive behavior and confirmed that she had knowingly filed false reports because she was convinced she could force me to remove my propane tanks. Carol's defense attorney tried to argue that she genuinely believed there was a safety hazard and that her actions, while perhaps overzealous, were not criminal. But the prosecutor countered with the evidence that Carol had been informed multiple times by authorities that there were no violations, and she had continued her harassment anyway. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning with a guilty verdict on both charges, filing false police reports and violating a restraining order. At sentencing 2 weeks later, the judge was stern but measured. "Mrs. Davenport, you allowed your personal feelings and desire for control to override your common sense and your respect for the law. You harassed an innocent man, wasted valuable law enforcement resources, and showed contempt for this court's authority by violating a restraining order." Carol stood silently, her face drawn and tired. She had aged visibly over the past few months. "I am sentencing you to 1 year of supervised probation, 100 hours of community service, and a fine of $2,000. Additionally, you are permanently barred from holding any position of authority in any homeowners association. If you violate the terms of your probation or the permanent restraining order, you will face jail time. Do you understand?" "Yes, Your Honor," Carol said quietly. After the sentencing, I left the courthouse feeling a strange mix of relief and sadness. I had never wanted any of this. I just wanted to live peacefully in my home with my backup propane tank stored safely in my shed. But Carol's obsession and abuse of power had forced me to defend myself, and the legal system had ultimately held her accountable. Gerald approached me outside the courthouse. "Michael, I want to apologize again for everything Carol put you through. I know my apology does not fix anything, but I am truly sorry." "I appreciate that, Gerald. I know this was not your fault," I said. "How are you doing?" "Better, actually. The divorce is almost final and I am starting to rebuild my life." I should have stood up to her years ago, but I kept thinking she would change. He shook his head. "I hope you can finally have some peace." "I think I can," I said, and I did. Over the following months, the neighborhood continued to heal from the Carol era. David proved to be an excellent HOA president, focused on actual community improvement rather than petty enforcement. We organized neighborhood barbecues, fixed the community playground, and even started a neighborhood watch program. My propane tanks remained exactly where they had always been, properly stored in my shed, ready for emergencies. Nobody ever complained about them again. About a year after Carol's sentencing, I was grilling burgers in my backyard when David stopped by with his wife and kids. We had become good friends through the whole ordeal. "You know, Michael, in a weird way, maybe Carol did us all a favor," David said as we watched his kids play in the yard. "How do you figure that?" I asked, flipping a burger. "She showed us what happens when we let HOA boards have too much unchecked power. The changes we made to our CC and our TKS, the protections we put in place, those are going to help future residents avoid going through what you went through." And she reminded us that we are supposed to be a community, not a dictatorship. "I guess that is one way to look at it," I said. "Though I could have done without the death threats and false arrests," David laughed. "Fair point. But hey, at least you have a great story for parties now." "Yeah, the time my HOA president tried to steal my propane tanks and ended up with a criminal record. Real party material," I joked. But as we stood there, grilling food and watching kids play while the Arizona sun set over the mountains, I realized David was right. The neighborhood was better off now. We had learned that standing up to abuse of power matters, that following the law matters, and that communities function best when people treat each other with respect and common sense. Carol finished her probation without incident. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she moved to another state to live near her sister. Gerald stayed in Prescott and started dating someone new, apparently much happier than he had been in years. As for me, I continued working at the hospital, maintaining my home and, yes, keeping my backup propane tanks properly stored in my shed. Every time I opened that padlock I had installed during the worst of Carol's harassment, I was reminded of how important it is to know your rights and stand up for them. The whole experience taught me that sometimes the most absurd situations can have the most serious consequences. What started as a busybody HOA president fixating on propane tanks escalated into harassment, false police reports, restraining orders, and ultimately criminal convictions. It showed me that power, even in something as seemingly mundane as a homeowners association, can corrupt people who are not held accountable. But it also taught me about the importance of documentation, knowing the law, and having good neighbors who will stand up for what is right. Without the support of David and the other reasonable board members, without Attorney Palmer's expertise, and without the legal system ultimately working as it should, Carol's harassment could have continued indefinitely or even escalated further. I still live in Copper Ridge. My house is paid off, my neighbors are great, and the HOA is run by people who understand that their job is to maintain common areas and enforce reasonable rules, not to micromanage everyone's lives. We have community events, people look out for each other, and there is a genuine sense of neighborhood pride. And whenever a new family moves into the development, someone inevitably tells them the story of Carol Davenport and the Great Propane Tank War of 2026, as it has come to be called. It serves as both a cautionary tale and a reminder that standing up to bullies, even ones with clipboards and HOA bylaws, is always worth it. Sometimes late at night, when I am coming home from a shift at the hospital, I look at my storage shed and smile. Those backup propane tanks, the ones that Carol was so obsessed with removing, they are still there, still properly stored, still completely legal, and still ready in case of emergency. They have become more than just fuel storage to me. They represent the principle that people have the right to peaceful enjoyment of their property without harassment from petty tyrants. The legal system worked, justice was served, and life moved on. Carol Davenport learned that being HOA president does not put you above the law, and I learned that standing your ground, documenting everything, and following proper legal channels can prevail even against seemingly relentless harassment. In the end, it was never really about propane tanks. It was about power, control, and what happens when someone abuses a position of minor authority. Carol thought she could bully me into submission, that she could use her HOA position to force her will on others regardless of rules, regulations, or basic decency. She was wrong, and she paid the price for that miscalculation. The neighborhood is peaceful now, the way it should be. People maintain their properties, follow reasonable rules, and treat each other with respect. The HOA functions as it was intended to, as a body that maintains common areas and protects collective interests, not as a vehicle for personal vendettas and power trips. And me. I still have my backup propane tanks, securely locked in my shed, and I sleep soundly knowing that I stood up for my rights and helped ensure that no other resident of Copper Ridge would have to endure what Carol put me through. Sometimes doing the right thing is exhausting and expensive and frustrating, but it is always worth it. The security cameras I installed during the worst of the harassment are still there too, and they have proven useful beyond the Carol situation. They give me peace of mind when I am at work, and they have captured everything from package deliveries to the occasional curious raccoon exploring my backyard. Every time I check the footage, I am reminded of how important evidence and documentation were in proving my case against Carol's false accusations. Attorney Palmer and I stayed in touch. He occasionally sends me interesting HOA cases he is working on, usually with a note saying something like, "This one is almost as crazy as yours." We have coffee every few months, and he always asks how the propane tanks are doing. It has become a running joke between us. The fire inspector, Rodriguez, actually stopped by my house about 6 months after Carol's trial. He said he was in the neighborhood doing routine inspections and wanted to check in on how things were going. I showed him that everything was still properly maintained, and he complimented me again on my setup. "You know, your case became something of a training example at the department," he told me. "We use it to teach new inspectors about how to handle situations where people call us for HOA disputes rather than actual safety issues. It is a reminder to stick to the facts and the code, not get involved in personal conflicts." I found that both amusing and vindicating. At least some good had come from Carol's harassment, even if it was just serving as a teaching example for fire inspectors. The HOA board under David's leadership implemented several reforms that have made life better for everyone in Copper Ridge. They established clear appeal processes for any violations or fines, requiring multiple board members to approve any enforcement action. They also created term limits for board positions and mandatory training for anyone taking on an HOA leadership role. The training covers legal responsibilities, ethical conduct, and the actual limitations of HOA authority. These changes were formally presented at a neighborhood meeting about 8 months after Carol's conviction. Nearly every household sent at least one representative, and the reforms were approved unanimously. Several people stood up during the meeting to thank me for standing up to Carol's harassment, saying it had prompted necessary changes that would protect everyone going forward. One neighbor, an elderly woman named Helen who lived 3 houses down from me, told me afterward that Carol had been harassing her for years about her garden decorations. "I was too scared to fight back because I thought she had all the power," Helen said. "Seeing you stand up to her and win gave me hope. I am glad she is gone." Hearing stories like Helen's made me realize the full extent of Carol's impact on the neighborhood. I was not her only target, just the one who finally fought back hard enough to stop her. It made me wonder how many other neighborhoods have HOA tyrants who go unchecked because residents do not know their rights or are too intimidated to challenge them. Gerald sold the house he had shared with Carol about a year after their divorce was finalized. He moved into a condo closer to downtown Prescott, a place with minimal HOA involvement. I ran into him at a local coffee shop not long after he moved. "I should have left years ago," he admitted over coffee. "I kept making excuses, thinking things would get better, but Carol just got more obsessed with controlling everything around her. It started with the HOA stuff, but it was like that in our marriage too. Everything had to be her way or it was wrong." He looked healthier and happier than I had ever seen him during his marriage to Carol. He had started hiking and had joined a local cycling club. He was rebuilding his life, finding out who he was outside of his relationship with Carol. "I heard she moved to Nevada," Gerald told me. "Living with her sister in Reno. Maybe being away from the HOA president position will help her. I do not know. I hope she gets help, but that is not my responsibility anymore." I appreciated Gerald's perspective. It was easy to demonize Carol, but hearing him talk about her made me realize she was a person with serious control issues and possibly deeper psychological problems. That did not excuse her behavior or the harm she caused, but it added dimension to the situation. The propane tanks themselves became something of a neighborhood legend. When new residents move in, people often point out my house and tell the story. Some people have jokingly referred to my place as the house that started the revolution because it led to the HOA reforms. I take it all with good humor, though I would have preferred to avoid the whole situation entirely. About 18 months after Carol's conviction, I was featured in a local newspaper article about HOA disputes and homeowner rights. The reporter had heard about my case and wanted to write a piece about the importance of knowing your rights when dealing with homeowners associations. I agreed to the interview, hoping it might help other people in similar situations. The article generated quite a bit of response. I received emails and phone calls from people all over Arizona, and even some from other states, dealing with their own HOA nightmares. I could not provide legal advice, but I shared my experience and encouraged people to document everything, know their CC and RTCS, and not be afraid to seek legal help when an HOA oversteps its authority. One person who reached out was a man in Phoenix whose HOA was trying to force him to remove solar panels from his roof, even though Arizona has laws protecting homeowners' rights to install solar energy systems. I connected him with attorney Palmer, who helped him fight the HOA's overreach. Last I heard, he won his case and the HOA had to reimburse his legal fees. These connections reminded me that my experience with Carol, as frustrating and stressful as it had been, had created an opportunity to help others facing similar situations. It gave the whole ordeal a sense of purpose beyond just defending my own property rights. At work, my coworkers had followed the whole saga with fascination. Working in an emergency room, we see all kinds of conflicts and their consequences, but everyone found the HOA propane tank war particularly entertaining. My colleagues started jokingly calling me Propane Mike, a nickname that stuck around far longer than I would have liked. One of the ER doctors, Dr. Sarah Chen, told me she had her own HOA horror story about them trying to ban her from parking her motorcycle in her own driveway. But after hearing what you went through, my situation does not seem so bad, she said. At least my HOA president did not try to get me arrested. The shared experiences of dealing with overreaching HOAs created a strange camaraderie among people at work and in the broader community. It seemed like almost everyone had a story about ridiculous HOA rules or enforcement, though few had dealt with anything quite as extreme as Carol's campaign against my propane tanks. Life continued its steady rhythm. I kept working my shifts at the hospital, maintaining my house and participating in neighborhood activities. David and I served together on a committee to update the community playground, which was completed about 2 years after Carol's conviction. At the playground dedication, several parents thanked me again for standing up to Carol, saying they felt much more comfortable in the neighborhood now. I used to be afraid to let my kids play outside because Carol would complain about every little thing, one mother told me. Now it actually feels like a community where families can relax and enjoy living here. Comments like that reinforced my belief that fighting Carol's harassment had been the right choice, even though it had been exhausting and expensive at the time. The neighborhood was genuinely better off without her toxic presence and abuse of power. The permanent restraining order remained in effect, though it became largely irrelevant after Carol moved to Nevada. I occasionally wondered how she was doing and whether she had gained any self-awareness about her behavior. Gerald told me she had never apologized or acknowledged any wrongdoing, instead maintaining that she had been unfairly persecuted for trying to protect the neighborhood. Some people never learn, I suppose, but that was not my problem anymore. Carol was out of my life, out of the neighborhood, and no longer had any power over anyone in Copper Ridge. The criminal conviction and probation were permanent marks on her record, consequences of her choice to harass, file false reports, and violate court orders. My backup propane tanks remain in my storage shed to this day, properly secured and maintained. I test them periodically and have actually had to use them twice during power outages. Both times, I appreciated having the backup power supply that Carol had been so obsessed with removing. Those tanks provided electricity for my refrigerator and basic needs during outages that lasted several hours. Each time I use them, I think about the absurdity of Carol's crusade. She had been so convinced these tanks were dangerous, so obsessed with removing them, that she had committed crimes and destroyed her own reputation and marriage in the pursuit of that goal. And for what? The tanks were never dangerous. They were never a legitimate concern. They were just a target she fixated on as a way to exert control over someone else. The whole experience fundamentally changed how I view community associations and positions of minor authority. I now understand that bylaws and rules are only as good as the people enforcing them. In the wrong hands, even limited power can be abused in damaging ways. But I also learned that systems of accountability, when properly utilized, can check that abuse of power. 3 years after the initial confrontation, life in Copper Ridge is peaceful and pleasant. The neighborhood has grown closer, the HOA functions properly, and property values have actually increased. It turns out that having a reasonable HOA that focuses on actual community improvement rather than petty enforcement is good for everyone. I still live in the same house, still work at the same hospital, and still have those backup propane tanks in my storage shed. The padlock I installed during the worst of Carol's harassment remains in place, though now it is more out of habit than necessity. The security cameras are still active, providing peace of mind and occasionally capturing footage of wildlife or neighborhood kids playing. And sometimes, when I am grilling in my backyard on a warm Arizona evening, I look at that storage shed and remember everything that happened. The harassment, the legal battles, the stress and fear and anger. But I also remember standing up for myself, following the law, and ultimately prevailing against someone who thought their position gave them unlimited authority. The Great Propane Tank War of 2026, as the neighborhood still calls it, taught me valuable lessons about rights, documentation, perseverance, and the importance of holding people accountable when they abuse power. It was not an experience I would choose to repeat, but I am proud of how I handled it and grateful for the positive changes that came from it. Carol Davenport tried to take my propane tanks and ended up losing her position, her reputation, her marriage, and gaining a criminal record. It is a steep price to pay for trying to exert control over something that was never any of her business in the first place. But those were the consequences of her own choices, her own escalating harassment and illegal conduct. As for me, I am still here, living peacefully in my home in Prescott, Arizona, with my backup propane tanks safely stored exactly where they have always been. And that is exactly how it should be.